This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hi there, I'm Elise, and I'm so excited to help produce This Restorative Justice Life podcast. We are so excited to have Desirée Anderson as our guest today. Desiree has worked in higher education at the Intercultural Center at St. Mary's College of California and also in multicultural affairs at Tulane University in New Orleans. The grind never stops for her, though, because she is currently pursuing her Ph.D. at the University of New Orleans. So this episode features some really great dialogue about empathy, higher education, and restorative justice practices. In addition to our weekly podcast, Amplify RJ has many engaging opportunities planned for Black History Month. You should go check out our Black Her Story reading list that highlights many empowering Black women. You can find some more details on our Instagram page or in the show notes. We are also hosting a History of Black Abolition Movements workshop on Saturday, February 6th and 27th from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific Time. Well, enough of me. Let's get into this conversation.
Welcome, Desiree. Who are you?
Short answer, easy one. I am Desirée Anderson.
Who are you?
I'm the child of Barbara Lee Minor.
Who are you?
I'm an educator and seeker of liberation.
Who are you?
I am hungry.
Who are you?
I am a person who loves to help others, sometimes to the sacrifice of herself.
Who are you?
I don't know, I'm running out of things of who I am. I'm like, what am I? I'm wearing my Louisville sweatshirt today, so I'm a proud Louisville Cardinal.
And finally, who are you?
I am a girl who's caught between Southern living and California dreaming.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to get into some of those intersections and a lot more. I do want to give you an opportunity. Do you want to grab a bite really quick? We have some time.
No, it's fine.
So then with the fullness of the question, given all that this last year has brought us and, where we are now, how are you?
I think the introvert side of me is content of being in this kind of isolation and social distancing. But I think the educator in me, the person who kind of does this restorative work, is in a deep state of frustration that we're still in the year of 2020 having the same conversations that we've been having for however long we've been having them, and I think in this time and in this year where people have a little bit more time perhaps to do their own learning and things like that it's still not quite happening. And so I think that I just did basically an emotional intelligence thing, and my lowest score was optimism. So that pretty much sums that up. And so it's high emotional, intelligence broadly speaking, but my outlook on life is kind of if you set the bar low, people just won't disappoint you anymore. So I think that's kind of where I'm at this juncture in life of just, hope for the best, but just assume the worst.
That resonates on a painful level. But I do want to ask, what does give you hope?
I mean, I think even with that particularly, again, I work with young adults, I work with college-age students for the most part, and so I think seeing them and the work that they're striving to do this generation, and knowing that there are folks who are actively trying to do their own learning and unlearning, and are challenging systems, and so recognizing that there every generation, there people still have that kind of, that there are other people who are more optimistic than me, who are continuing to want to do this work. And so that's really where I find hope.
Yeah, definitely. Like, community is so key for us to be able to continue this work, not just because like we actually need other people to physically do the work, but
Right.
to keep our own spirits up, and to know that a different world is possible. And the world that we're trying to build is one that's rooted in interconnection, right? Restorative justice and community. You've been doing this work for a while, probably before you knew the words restorative justice. So in your own words, how did this work get started for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always thought about justice systems in very, I'm not like unique ways, but just different ways, probably comparative to other people. Being around folks who have been in prison, and being able to see them as whole humans, like worthy of love. But then also recognizing that the way that we often think about justice or punishment just never felt quite right to me. And so I think my initial kind of understanding of this different type of reconciliation really didn't happen until 2013. I was at an educational conference, and we were talking about the school to prison pipeline. And that's where I first relearned the term restorative justice in this particular context. And I'd heard the term before in relation to criminal justice, but never really did my own work around it. But once I understood it as something that could be done in an educational setting, I was like, immediately went home and was like, and Google search. What is this? How do we do this? What do we do? And I got connected with the Center for Restorative Approaches in the city of New Orleans, and did some collaborative work with them. And we did kind of a trade-off, which is, they might have gotten a better deal. But they allowed me to do their 4-day training for free. And I helped them develop some surveying instruments, and help do some kind of observational work. And I think from there, doing the training and then doing some of that observational work and then working closely with a non-traditional high school, I quickly kind of fell in love with the principles, and the framework and philosophy of what restorative justice could do. And I think it just aligned with my own personal values around justice. And again, seeing people as whole and recognizing that the root cause of people who cause harm is often because they too have been harmed. And how do we address those things? And so, yeah, that just kind of, it was there and it lingered for a little while. And then I kind of picked it back up into my own practice and work. Because I was having students who were assigned, if you will, to meet with me for being like, racist or homophobic or anti-Semitic. And I was just like, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. Like, I'm sure that there's some educational things that are happening here in the moment, but it also felt like the people who were impacted were being left out of that process. And for me, that was like, that this doesn't make any sense. So what can we do about it? And that was what then drove my dissertation. And then my work from there, and then the book chapter, and so forth. So
yeah,
I don't know.
That was a ton, and like that's what we're here to like dive into. I want to like go all the way back to the beginning of what you said, how you talked about like growing up around people who have been in prison, and those people, you see them as people, not just like the terrible thing that like, or the worst thing that they've ever done in their life. Those are people that you had relationships with outside of that. so much of this work, right, is about having people be seen for like the fullness of their humanity, the good, wise, and powerful inside all of them, despite, the harmful actions that people have taken.
Right.
How did that become really clear for you growing up?
I mean, part of it is, I think, too, just this idea of, like, what is crime? Like, I think that was a question that was always just kind of in the back of my head. Like, who decided that this thing was illegal? Like, right? Like, who decided that this thing... because, like, equality and morality are not... They're not mutually exclusive, right? Like, they don't necessarily intersect all the time. So things that we may think as being immoral could be legal, and things that we think of being, moral could be illegal. And so it just, I think, so my mom gave me, it's like, thanks, this is the best birthday present ever. The African American Almanac. I don't know if you've ever seen that big book, but it is huge. And part of my gift as a child was to read about these people, basically, and tell her about, a random person, like, once a week, basically. I had to, like, learn about these beautiful, wonderful Black people. And in recognizing and doing some of that work, I think that's where I really started to understand, like, how much of the things that, like, these individuals were denied were legal. Like, it was legal to deny these people things. And so that kind of concept, I think, kind of stuck with me. And then thinking about the people in my life who were kind of going in and out of prison for things that were deemed illegal, that I, like, yeah, sure, could they be harmful to communities? Maybe, but they're more harmful to themselves than anything else. And why did this thing become a thing that is a crime against the state? But we're not talking about it really in the context of, like, the harm against people. Because that is the supposed reason for this punishment of moving people away. But we're not actually doing any of things that then will actually help the people that they are supposedly harming. Mm-hmm. And so it was like the cyclical, like, okay, wait. So you're telling me we're putting these people away because they harm these people, but we're not actually doing anything to help the people that they supposedly harmed. And then they're going to come back into the communities for which they harmed to do more harm because we didn't do anything while they were there to fix the reasons that they harmed the people that they... Wait, okay. So it was a lot of this, like, talking in circle for myself.
It doesn't make sense.
It just doesn't make sense. And then again, because they were so close to me as an individual, was like, well, they're not bad people. They're not trying to harm people. They're trying to survive for themselves. So, like, what... Like, again, it was just a lot of, like, this doesn't make sense. Who decided this? Who created this process? Who created this? Who had the power to make this happen? And then who has the power to change it? And I never quite really understood that answer, like the who has the power to change it, until much later in life. But yeah, it was just a lot of, like, this just doesn't make sense. And I wasn't, of course, using the term harm at the time, but that concept was definitely in my head from, like, 6th grade on, of, like, this don't make no sense. Why doesn't it make sense? Somebody help me. And no one could help me at the time. Right.
Yeah, there's this piece, one of your co-authors in the Colorizing Restorative Justice book talks about, how can we have a restorative process when the state is the one that's doing the harm, right? It's just like when we send people to prison or to jail, or, like, even, like, on electronic monitoring or on probation, right? Like, what are the supports that we're doing to help them change their circumstances, right? What are the things within their communities that are intentionally underfunded, right, to prevent those circumstances from happening, right? We talk about I don't know, when you talk about restorative justice or teach, what on top of the iceberg is what happened. What's below the iceberg is like the root causes, right? But what about the water all around the iceberg that is contributing to like all those issues? It's not just like, oh, this person did this because they're trying to fuel their drug habit, right? Their drug habit is caused by like all these other things, and these things are caused by the economic conditions, racism, white supremacy, all of the things around it that contribute. And so to restore that person's drug habit really isn't like helping the whole.
Right. Yeah, I mean, exactly. We're creating systems that like just create a cycle that people just cannot seem to get out of, and by not addressing that root, it just, again, people, end up in and out, and it becomes, quick fixes in terms of like, well, I need to make money, but I can't make money because I'm an ex-con, and I'm an ex-con because if I didn't make money. So now, well, okay, I'm here, and now I got to do these things, and you're like, it just, this cycle and cycle and cycle that, has done nothing for really anyone. And how do we change it? And also, how do we see those people as worthy of change? And there was a time when for like, I don't know, maybe like a 2-year period where like rehabilitation was like a part of our systems, but even within that, they weren't great.
Yeah. So yeah, you've been thinking about all of these, like from the age of 12, maybe earlier, up through high school. You decided to go into education. Where did you see the intersection of this work? You talked about learning about the school to prison pipeline, but how did you, how did you decide like this is where I want to put my energy and time?
Yeah, I mean, my undergraduate, so in the 6th grade, I decided I wanted to be a psychologist, which is where all of this kind of formatted, because again, I was thinking about like, what is the psychology behind a person who decides to do these types of things that get them into trouble? But like, and then what are the systems that, put them in a position where they feel like they have to do this? So for me, it was about how do I understand the human nature of a person and how they kind of operate in the systems that are around them. And so like from 6th grade on, it was like psychology. Like I didn't know exactly what within psychology, but I was like, people, minds, thought processes, I need to understand. I want to understand people. Yeah. And, did a lot of work as an undergraduate student and was involved in a number of different capacities. And again, all of my work from even when I was in high school, I worked at a teen center and a youth center. Like, so being with and engaging with people has always kind of been my thing. And then when I was deciding on where to go for my master's degree program, I was thinking about counseling psychology, but then ultimately ended up doing higher education. It was a long title, Educational and Counseling Psychology, with an emphasis in college student personnel. And part of it was thinking like, where a lot of people are really able to do a lot of that unlearning is in higher education. So when they're in their undergraduate experiences for the first time, they're away from the communities that have taught them one way, and they're now being situated in a position where there's opportunities without kind of home influences that perhaps are like telling them not to unlearn things, to be in a more open environment and more open space to challenge maybe their lived experience, the things that they know to be true. And my really thing was like, how do I support other people in doing that kind of like that unlearning or really discovering themselves for the first time. And so then that became kind of like my new, like, how do I just support people in this unlearning process? And so then education kind of became the thing. It was like my jam, if you will, and kind of just stuck. And I've been working in higher education since 2006 full time. And then the restorative piece of that really, I think, just added to this idea of what we're doing in that space is as we're helping to kind of heal and recognize and understand harms, we're also doing is we're unlearning things. We're trying to help the people, both those who have been impacted and those who are causing the harm, to kind of unlearn and unearth like the root cause of where this pain is coming from and how it's impacting their personal relationships, the relationship with the community around them. And so I think that that's just like been both an unconscious kind of thing that like is just kind of like people and feelings and empathy, and I feel what you feel, so much so that like I forget what it's called all the time, that like literally when I watch people fall, my legs tingle. Like so it's,
I don't know if I was gonna like make up a term like somatic empathy or something like that.
There's an actual term for it, but I can never remember what it's called. And because I was like, I feel like this is not normal, and I went to the doctor and they're like, it's normal. I'm like, oh, okay, great. So I'm not abnormal. I mean, I'm abnormal, but it's a normal abnormality.
It's a known thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, oh, okay, thanks. It's good to know that I'm just not an emotional hot mess. Well, I mean, I am an emotional hot mess, but that's not the reason why I feel pain when I watch people fall or get hurt on TV.
Mm-hmm.
I remember what we were talking about now.
No worries. I think that like leads us to like a good place to dive into like what you talked about in this book, Colorizing Restorative Justice, like restorative justice co-opting, higher education co-opting restorative justice work. For you, I had the conversation 2 hours ago. For everybody listening, I had this conversation weeks ago with Sandra Sosa about, through our conversation, something really clicked for me where, there are people who have been doing restorative justice work from, like, not even using the word restorative justice, right? Knowing it from indigenous perspectives and like, this is just the way that we are. We value interconnection. This is the way that we build relationships. This is how we honor equity. This is how we honor the whole person. And of course, when there is harm, we're going to repair that harm. And this is just the way things are. Because of colonization, white supremacy, and all that, those ways have been hidden and had to be preserved, and so they are not mainstream anymore. But now that we live in a culture dominated by white supremacy culture, colonization, there are people like you who grow up only knowing a culture of white supremacy and dominance and questioning it. And now we bring in something like restorative justice that can be seen as an alternative, right? And you talk about, like, in your book, in the chapter, like, this is not an alternative. I just want to kind of let you go off of that prompt.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. It's not an alternative, right? And I often say that, like, whenever I'm talking to people about restorative justice, I was like, if you think you can turn on a restorative justice hat, then you're not doing it right. Because restorative justice is a way of being. It's not a thing that you do. And because, again, it is a way that people have existed for as long as there have been people. Restitution and what we would now kind of label as restorative justice or restorativeness have kind of coexisted for a long time. And it wasn't really until, I mean, we don't want to get into like the Bible and the Quran and stuff like that, but even in those spaces, the way that often retribution happened is not the same way that we have retribution now in our current society. Thank you, King Henry I. But just a little, if anyone wants to research, the legislatus of Henry C.I., the 1100s, it's his fault that we have our current criminal justice system. So thank him. But this idea that, like, the systems that we have right now, if we see restorative justice as an alternative, then we see it as something we can plug and play. Something that we can, like, I'm going to take this piece here, or I'm going to take this piece, and we're just going to do this and, like, tie it with our current system. But the reality is, like, there are ways in which they can cohabitate, if you will, or they can coexist in systems simultaneously, but the reality is that they're operationalized very differently. They do different things, and so you cannot take a system that requires minimums and do that with restorative justice. because there are no minimums, right? Like, we as a collective decide what the outcome is going to be, how we're going to resolve the situation. You cannot pair that with a system that mandates if X happens, Y then also has to happen. So those two things don't work together. You cannot pair a system where on the one hand you're, again, I'm telling you have caused harm, even if you have not admitted any such harm. I am finding you responsible, with a system which is asking people to say, this is a name, how I have caused harm, who I have harmed in the process, to be able to then hold myself accountable with the support of other people. If you just told me I was responsible and then told me I've got these things to do, that's not happening. I don't have to take any type of actual ownership or accountability in that space. You just tell me what to do, I'll do the thing. I never actually admitted if I did it or not. Now I'm also
no incentive to.
No incentive to participate. Our current systems, our Western culture doesn't create space. So even reality is, even if I wanted to own the things that I have done to another person, we have created no system for that to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So if I harm you and I'm like, David, I would like to apologize to you, the way that our current society is set up is you, David, are probably not even going to want to talk to me, because you're going to assume that I'm not actually going to want to apologize to you, because we've not ever done that. So you're realistically avoiding me. And then if for some reason you do decide you want to talk to me, I, as like the person who's caused harm, I don't know how to take accountability. I don't know how really to apologize, because we've not seen any really good examples of how to do that. And so then the apology is not really genuine, or maybe it is genuine, but it still doesn't meet the needs of you who's been harmed. And so we've not set up any structure to be able to really do that. And so how do you mesh a system that basically says you don't actually have to apologize or take ownership with a system that's actually asking you to do all of this work to do those things? So they don't work together in a lot of ways. And so I was fearful that these white supremacist systems as institutions of higher education, like, ooh, buzzword, restorative justice, yes, this sounds great, love it, let's do it, and then be like, yeah, we're going to do a restorative process, but also there's still some mandatory minimums, and also there's still, you found responsible, so now you're going to go through this restorative process. No.
For those of you who aren't watching this, I'm getting a lot of like, what the hell are we doing? Right? It doesn't line up. The big question is then, like, are these compatible? I mean, like, you're trying to do the work.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
There are ways in which they are compatible in terms of what our ultimate goals are in the processes, right? So if we think about it in terms of like what we want the outcomes to be in our process, there are ways in which I'm going to just use the term traditional conducts or traditional criminal system process and restorative processes can be compatible. But the reality is that like the way that we function makes it so that they can't be, right? So they really just have to operate as kind of two very distinctive things, and they cannot really mesh together, at least in terms of doing for the justice part of it to happen, right? So there's restorative practice and some restorative elements can be embedded, if you will, into your traditional processes. So the way that the language that they use, the way that we use restorative questioning can be added or embedded into traditional processes. So it, we could still be, again, trying to get to the root cause of harm, all of those types of things. We could still kind of embed some of the framework there. We could still do like addressing like harm in terms of doing like harm circles, or community building aspects can still be done. But for the justice part of that to actually happen, where accountability, meeting the needs of the harm, meeting the needs of the community kind of all intersect together, I don't see where traditional processes, at least as though they currently kind of operate, and restorative justice kind of like being compatible in that way. I think it just takes, again, because part of it is we have to already rethink and reorient people to the ideas of what justice even is, right? And so how do you convince your stakeholders and people that like dismissing someone from a community isn't actually helpful? And yet at the same time, the problem is, and I think I wrote this in the chapter, I don't really remember, but like the way that our current systems are is that they already privilege people, certain people. Mm-hmm. And as we think about in systems that already privilege people, introducing this kind of framework, will it ultimately still privilege those same people in that process? So in terms of like thinking about how do you convince the people who have been disenfranchised by our current systems, who see it as your community has been ravished and like demolished by our traditional systems, and now we're like, let's talk about this idea of justice from this different lens, and we want to introduce it. But what I see perhaps as a person who comes from a community that has just been disenfranchised is, well, where was this at when my community was being destroyed? And now these people get the benefit of this new system, whereas my community was destroyed. And so I want to see them get the same type of punishment that we had gotten for a long time, because is it fair? And so how do you really work with people to understand that, like, yeah, these people who maybe have been privileged by the system before are going to get this privilege, but also you are going to get this privilege, you know, at that point it's no longer a privilege, but you will get this benefit, you know, as well. Again, assuming that you actually do make it right, so that everybody can be participating in the process, which becomes another part of the systemic thing, is like who gets the benefit of such a process. So then you have to ask that question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming up for me is like there are some common goals and like very different goals, right? So from an institution trying to implement these processes are being implemented so we can include more people into our system and make them feel safe. But we still want to do things our way, and we still want to survive and thrive as an institution. When justice might say like, no, you need to give up your power, or maybe you don't need to exist as an institution at all, right?
Right.
And like
exactly.
And that's where it clashes, right? We can talk about higher education, we can talk about policing, we can talk about a lot of institutions, right? In that framework, because like I do know for a fact, right, that there are very well-intentioned people in higher education or in policing. Let's talk about let's just talk about higher education, because that's what the chapter is about, who want to do things better than they are, right? And say like, okay, let's adopt these restorative practices and make them fit into, you know, what we have. Is that net positive, or is that just corrupting something that was good?
Yes. To both. I mean, I think that there are, so I guess it depends on like how deep are you trying to go. So I think that there is some net positive, again, in the way in which, you know, entering into the conversation with the thought process of like identifying harms, not just violating policy, becomes a net positive in that way, right? And switching and thinking about that system, because then we start thinking about like secondary targets, or we start thinking about like the community, the smaller community by which those individuals are, you know, invested in that space. But I also think, and I'm always cautious when I'm like working with institutions. I'm like, if you're doing any of these processes, just don't call them restorative justice, or don't call them restorative practices. Just do them, but don't use this language, because I think there are ways in which it does kind of, it could lead to corruption of an actual process or practice, because you're not doing the justice part of it. You're doing you're addressing a piece, but you're not really getting to the justice part of it. And so that's why I'm always very careful. Like, I think justice is not going to be happening in institutions of higher education for a really long time, unless we completely destroy them, and start anew, or get rid of our conduct systems and start fresh. So I don't know that restorative justice is what is happening or can happen in institutions of higher education, but I do think that there are ways in which restorative practices can still help alleviate some of the pain that manifests at those institutions, because we're not taking basic care of the people who are at the institutions. And so how do we address those things, or making space for them to feel heard and validated? And how do we focus on the community building piece of it, so that people have the right community to want to be able to, one, on the preventative side of things, like, you know, I will hopefully then, like, not want to actively harm you, because I now see you as, like, a person who's, like, worth of my respect. But then, like, if I do harm you, then wanting to try to find ways to make amends. So I think for me, I really think that the ultimate goal that I hope is that, like, the community building aspect of what restorative practices can do is where the focus is in higher education. And it should be the majority of your work, broadly speaking, anyways. And so that's where I see the net positive happening. But in terms of, like, using that language of, like, restore the justice piece of it, I'm like, I don't think that that's ever going to really happen.
So you say, like, restorative practice instead of restorative justice?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, like, words are important and language evolves. And when we're talking about a phrase that's been thrown around since, like, the late 70s, restorative justice, right? It's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And, like, for me, as I'm growing Amplify RJ, thinking about how to introduce this to more people and not have it co-opted is a challenge, right? Because, like, I do think there are net positive things that don't just belong to restorative justice, right? If we think about, like, nonviolent communication is a practice that is restorative, and we can teach you about nonviolent communication, and that is a net positive thing, right? Are you doing restorative justice because you are communicating nonviolently? You're doing better, right?
Exactly.
That is that's a net positive thing. And have you, like, addressed the harm that you or an institution has like, inflicted? Not necessarily.
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That's really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So much when we do these.
So, like, I'm glad that makes sense. Yeah, and that's exactly how I think about it. I think that, like, there are things that we can do that I like to say, like, operates from a restorative lens. Again, like, how we're framing the questions, the types of things that we're doing, and how we're engaging people. But if we're not getting to, like, if we're not going to be able to actually address like, the root cause of a thing, or if we're not going to actually be able to, like, you know, we think about what do we need to do to make this person feel whole, and I was just doing a thing with an organization yesterday, and so, like, someone was asking, like, can you really, like, especially when you're thinking about things around, like, racial trauma and harm and things like that, because this idea of restoring things means to put it back to the way that it was, and there's really no way to do that. And so I'm like, I think about it in terms of, like, right, when we crack a cup, right, we drop a cup and we put it back together, it's gonna, for the most part, it's going to look completed, or it's going to look like it's pretty much put back together, but we know that there's still going to be little cracks and seals and things that are going to be missing. And so it's not so much of, like, I think, again, that language of, like, restoring something back to the way that it was, and it's like, well, no, we're never going to get anything back to the way that it was, but we are kind of recrafting it in a way that it can feel whole enough that you can use it, that it can be used. And that's kind of how I see this work here. And so there's pieces that we could do that can help seal some of those cracks or start to put it back together, even though we may not be able to like make it look the way that it once was.
The idea of getting things back to how they were has never sat well with me, because in order to do that, you need to time travel.
Right.
Right? Like,
right.
For me, like, the restorative piece is, like, to make things as whole as possible, right?
Right.
To be in right relationship. And to be in right relationship may mean, in some instances, like, you're creating a relationship that didn't exist in the first place, right? And yeah, that's something that's always stood out to me, because, like, you know, you do have a model of, you know, a cup breaking and, you know, you glue it back together, you tape it back together, you do whatever to get it back together, and, like, it can still function as a cup. But when we're talking about a relationship between people where there is harm and people don't know each other, restoration to me means, like, creating a relationship where those people can be. Like, it's not something that existed. And then some people will argue, okay, well, then now you're talking about transformative. And it's like, okay, now we're talking. And, like, I do want to be, like, sensitive to, like, the nuances of all of that.
Yeah.
But, like, none of, like, restorative justice, restorative practices, transformative justice, community accountability, like, I think we're all talking about, like, an indigenous way of being, like, in right relationship with, you know, all beings, like, being a good relative. One of the things that stood out to me also in the book is people who are resistant to this work. I want to read the quote out of a study by a bunch of people who are doing work around this, sociology, justice, and international relations in Australia and Japan. And I'm just going to read it verbatim. I know you know what you wrote, but for everybody else who's listening. So the authors of this study found that the preference for more punitive measures was fueled by fear of crime, fear of the poor, and the belief that traditional values are decaying. How do we work with people who have that as their worldview and bring them into a more restorative work?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that, again, is this idea of... So it's what I was talking about, too, this idea of, like, the unlearning piece of, like, thinking about, like, my work with, like, undergraduate students. And I promise y'all I'm not trying to, like, you know, it's not liberal indoctrination, I promise. I mean, it is a little bit, but but it's not from the perspective of, like, oh, my gosh, like, you libtards. Like, not like that, but, like, in the sense of what we have seen as kind of this traditional or conservative kind of way of thinking has left people unable to see and develop empathy for other people. And so part of that then is really, how do you get people to develop empathy? and and that's really hard. You can kind of get past that, like, this like, you know, people who are like, I'm you know, we're breaking our traditional values. So what's a traditional value, and why do you hold that, and why do you believe that? And so really it's about unpacking the stem of that belief, and then trying to find ways to connect that idea and belief to maybe where somebody else is coming from. And so again, when I've talked about before, like, this idea of, like, the community building piece is, like, the most essential part. And that, again, is, to your point earlier, like, when you're building relationships so that you can, which may, again, this idea may have to create a new relationship in order for, like, wholeness to kind of happen. It's in the same way of, like, when we now have to get these people to hear, you know, how we understand the world and understand it from these different perspectives and ways, so that allows them then to develop that empathy for the other person. And through that empathy and that development that we're creating through that kind of bonding, then we can start to see that, like, this idea of, like, punitiveness doesn't actually make me feel good, because now this person I've created this relationship with, this bond with, is going to experience a type of pain that I don't want for myself. So why would I want that for them? And so it, in theory, like, right, like, on paper, it's like, yeah, this is an easy step. Develop empathy empathy means I don't want my fellow man to be harmed, and therefore I don't want them to have to experience this punitive thing. And so it's like, yeah, it's in 3 easy steps. But not really, because the developing empathy part is that hard part. It's like, how do you really get people to let go of, and it's not even let go of their held beliefs, but like, how do they understand how their belief operates in relationship to other people and their beliefs, and how do
I think like the step before that is, how do you get them to stop and even think about that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In the hustle for survival every day that, you know, capitalism forces us to participate in, right? When people fear like not being able to put food on the table, not being able to pay their rent, not being able to, you know, take care of their needs, like, I'm not trying to have a conversation about like what everybody else is going through. I'm just trying to eat. And a source tells me like that those people over there are the problem. Right.
And so that's why I say, like, starting from their perspective of like just engaging them about like so like, again, I'm talking like, so if you're saying it's a sense of security, well, what does the sense of security mean for you? Like, what does that mean to you? And like, how do you get it in this way? And then thinking about, well, how can we get you that same sense of security in a different way? So starting from like, okay, it's like, well, I need, you know, these people to go back to where they're from. I'm like, well, what does those people going back to where they're from do for you? And as they kind of like unpack that or address that, like, okay, well then how else can we get you this without that thing happening? Which the reality is, then you start to like unpack it, like, it ain't got nothing to do with them. But we don't go immediately there, because, you know, they're like, what are you talking about? It's not their fault. I'm like, it's not their fault. But, you know, kind of, again, doing it in that kind of step. So starting with their own kind of thought process and breaking that down into kind of like little markers that you can start to break apart, or unpack, I should say, not break apart. You can hold your beliefs as long as you want to. But I want you to, you know, bring something else in there with it.
Right. It's an invitation, right? Not mandating like, no, you're wrong, and this is the way that you have to believe now. Right. How does that look like in your work with students?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's spending a number of like times, individual meetings, sometimes with like a single student or a group of students, to do some of that. Like, again, and asking that question repeatedly, what does that do for you? What does this thing help you accomplish? How can we get that accomplishment, or that thing that you say that you want, in a different way? And so kind of engaging in that conversation. And sometimes it can take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 meetings with an individual or a small group of people. Usually not that long, surprisingly, at least in some of the work that I've gotten to do. But I think, so a prime example, one that I think was, I always say it's fun, and it's so weird to talk about it being fun. But we had an incident with like a sports team, using a racial epithet in the direction of a Afro-Latina faculty. And so it was like, in working with the team, really was like about focusing first in our initial meeting, just really around what does it mean to be a team, and what does it mean to be a teammate, and like, how does your team know what it means to be like, what are the unwritten rules, and how do they learn it? So how does a first year player know what's acceptable and what's not? And we just spent the whole first time we met just really unpacking that, and like, what are your individual values, and then from that, using their own words and their own language to then start to contextualize like representation of like the institution, and, you know, how to, you know, people see them as a result of this kind of incident, and, you know, breaking apart like these different kind of elements, and then thinking about like, what does it mean to be like a bystander in your own team? So if you say that this is your community norm, or the things that you see are valuable, how will somebody know that if you're not challenging them in this belief and these ideas and these types of things? And so, and then doing that work and then leading that, you know, led to like having conversations around like, how do we get like, you know, people from like our institution to like support them? And I was like, well, it would be helpful if you didn't look like an ass. help them along, like, then people would support you. But if they think you're jerks because of these types of things that you do, why would they come and support you? So you got to do this work here to shift your image, and then you can get people to then want to come and support you because they're supporting you as individuals and as a collective team. But if I know these three guys over here, in a way, though it's not always fair, they represent your team. And if they're behaving this way, people are going to think the rest of y'all behave this way. So how do you hold each other accountable for how you want to be represented as a team? And so just really kind of like engaging in that type of work with them to get them to think in that process, and like, and then, you know, using again their own language in that process, and then that led to some additional work for a couple of years after that fact with the team, which was, again, it was a lot of fun. I had fun with them.
Yeah. How do you create the time to make that happen?
Good question. I mean, I think part of it is my roles on campus make it so that I can kind of make that time. And in those previous positions, I was in the leadership position, so I make my time, I make my schedule, if you will. So
right, like not you for yourself, so much of this work does take time, right? And how do you create that time for other people to engage in that kind of space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, that goes back to that idea what I was talking about too, like about how do you get your stakeholders invested in this process. And so if you're going to continue to think about this idea of like it fitting into your current model, it's not going to work, because to a degree there are some incidents or things that you may be addressing that could take the same amount of time as a traditional process. But I think you have to have the investment from, I think it like has an hourglass from the top and the bottom, and so no matter which direction you flip it, there are people who are invested in it. What usually ends up happening, again, whichever direction you flip it, there's the people in the middle who would like slow down your process a little bit. But you know, if we have that kind of momentum, and so again, it is the like investing in the community building process, because again, if multiple people are aware of like this idea of like being in circle or being a little bit more vulnerable, then when something does happen that you need to address, they're prepared to engage in that process, and it feels it's kind of like a normative behavior, a normative practice, and it's not a foreign thing to do. So that's a piece of it, thinking about how do you just incorporate the idea of circle practices in different elements. So doing it with roommate agreement processes, like again, thinking the higher education lens, doing stuff like this in your classes. So starting every class, doing, you know, rounds or check-in questions or things like that. So in that level, and then from your upper administration saying like, again, if we're going to be invested in this, then we have to commit time, both in terms of the resources, the people who can help to facilitate, and then, you know, other people's willingness to participate in the fullness of that process, and recognizing that, you know, we did that over the course of a month. And thankfully the coaches were like, we're going to just use our regular meeting time every week to do this. And then, you know, some other stuff. And so I'm like, but again, you know, their reputation was on the line. So I think they're a little bit more willing to engage in that process. I think about,
as I think about this, like, I'm trying to think about how to frame it in a way like, do this work not to like save face, or like not so you won't get sued, or not for like how do we frame it like in a positive? Because like you can say like, you know, stronger community relationships, higher accountability, respect among others, and a lot of times using those words, people are like, oh no, we're good, we got that, until it goes wrong.
Right. But I mean, I think again, so using like that critical race theory lens is that you do need that interest convergence, and that's where it is sometimes to get that stakeholder buy-in, is this is going to ultimately make y'all look a little bit better. And so if that's where we sometimes have to enter into the conversation, let's enter in there from there. But I think as people engage in the process, they can then find the value of it. They can find value of like being in circle. They can find, you know, again, this value of like, oh, I'm being seen as a student, as a human, and not, as a person who, engages in this like bad behavior or whatever else might be. And then from that, then wanting to continue to engage in the process. But, if that's how we have to enter sometimes, it's just like, if that's the interest convergence, that's the interest convergence.
Fair enough. In doing this work, what's been like an moment, and what did you learn from it?
What's been an moment? Probably all of it. I think, because it's, I think that the beauty and also the not frustration, the struggle or the challenge, I should say, of like, there's no one definition, there's no like exact model, there's no like step 1, 2, 3. There are basic things that like you should be engaging with in this process, but everything, which again is the beauty of it, is really situational. It's contextual. It's dependent upon the thing that you're addressing or the community that you are in. And I think that constantly also brings in this like, because you're like, okay, well now I have to like in a way start from scratch every single time with a group. And so I think the realization of that I cannot copy and paste like my outline from this last group that I worked with or this last thing and do it with this new group. And so I think that really is just like the learning process of like, it is in a way having to dump your mind completely and starting fresh each time. Again, this is when you're focusing on working with like around a particular incident, not necessarily when you're doing ongoing work with one particular community. But that is just like this constant like brain dump of like, okay, just ignore everything you just did in this last thing, because you have to start completely fresh, because these are completely new people who have different needs, who have different expectations, who have different understanding. And even if they're not aware of like restorative processes, you're still having to explain it without explaining it. I don't know if that's helpful, if that makes sense, but yeah. So I think that, I think it's just that constant like, oh, here we go again type of thing, more so than like I don't think I've had, thankfully, a like awful moment or thing or moment that I've experienced that has been like, that has rocked my world, I should say.
Yeah. No, and that's fine. It's that the answer of like, having to not treat any situation the same, like, is super important, because like the principles are the same, right? But the situations are as unique as the people who are engaged, and all humans are unique. And even like, I did this with this person this time, this person is also a different person, like 5 months later, right?
Yes.
And they've experienced a lot of different things, and maybe some of those things are similar, but you can't expect things to go exactly the same. People aren't that neat, and this work is not neat. What would you say to someone who is engaged in higher education, either as a student or someone who works in higher education, about like getting started in these practices?
I think one is I think obviously is researching and learning a little bit about its indigenous roots, for sure, because I think you have to really understand contextually like how different that worldview is from the world that you're used to. If you grew up in a particularly Western, but especially American culture, and by American I mean United States of America, let me not South America or Central America, but this part of the Americas, that your understanding of justice or even humanness is vastly different from what you're going to be trying to enter into to a degree. And so even if you, like me, from an earlier age was like, something about this don't make no sense, you're still deeply embedded in that culture and in those communities. And so spending a lot of time I think really rethinking and retraining yourself around what does accountability look like from this aspect of community, I think is going to be one of the most important things that you can do, because then that then helps you, again, become a person who is operating from a restorative lens all of the time, or at least as much of the time as you can. Because again, as I talked about at the beginning, for me, I see this restorativeness as something that is, and it's not a thing that you do. And so how do you constantly change the way that you are entering into spaces and entering into conversations with people? And so how do you make that like a habitual thing of how you show up in spaces before you ever start thinking about how you're going to do this with and for other people? So really doing that internal work first is the first step.
Yeah.
And then go read a bunch of other books, like Little Book of Restorative Justice, and then like the Colorizing book, read chapter 18.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, like, this was supposed to be a plug for, like, the CRJ book, because in the chapter that you wrote, you have a bunch of reflection questions for people to be asking themselves and their institutions. I realized one of the reflection questions was a version of what I asked you about, like, in your answer around, like, interest convergence, but, like, how do we get institutions to care about DEI and community because it's just essential to our well-being, not because, like, it supports the bottom line or it prevents us from getting sued or, you know, all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the answer for that. And I do think that I think part of it is finding the people in that community who do have that philosophy and that way of thinking, and starting to kind of build that coalition to make it clear. Because I think part of it right now is that people don't know who has a similar kind of mindset of them, and because we don't feel like there's enough of us, which there probably are more of us than there are other people, but we don't have the space or opportunities to connect with one another. It could feel like I can't speak up and challenge the normativeness of the white supremacist culture of higher education because we don't have institutional power. We're not on the board of trustees, we're not the board of regents, we're not the president, we're not, you know, in those different positions. And so it could feel like, well, I can't challenge this idea and shift the ethos of our community because it's just me, or it's just me and my little one friend over here. And so I think that is one way, is to start to find those people in those communities to start challenging that ethos. But I think, again, is at all levels of the institution, how do we, again, start to see people as human? So where do we start doing that development of the community building aspect work, even in the smallest way, where it's starting, you know, going into like your dean's council meeting and be like, let's use the talking stick. I'm not kidding, but I'm also kind of kidding there.
Or let's start with a check-in, right?
Yeah, like let's start with these basic things where, again, we start to operationalize this idea of like being in community with each other. And I think some campuses will be better at that than others, just based on how they, you know, if you take like a Texas A&M where, you know, based off of their football team, you've got like the 13th man type of thing, and they've got like their I forget what they're called, but like they're people who like basically lead the chants and stuff like that at the games, and like everybody knows them, and you've got like the overalls, and you've got like and they have their fish camp, and so there's things that they are embedding around the cultures and traditions of Texas A&M. Well, within that work, you've already got this thing that you started with this fish camp, where people are learning about these cultures and traditions of this institution. Well, why not embed this idea of like, you're developing community in that space, but let's be a little bit more intentional about how we're thinking about community in this aspect, right? And so there are some spaces where I think they could be a little bit better. They'll have an easier time, I think, of maybe doing some of that shifting and thinking. But again, it is unless we're literally just going to throw the whole institution away and start over, it's going to be really hard to operate from that lens of just like, yeah, people are worth like our love and attention, and that's why we should care. And so, because again, as already established, I'm not a very optimistic person. So I operate from the lens of like, that's not going to happen. So how do I get you on board? Well, if you want your students, as the demographics of this institution continue to change and you need more people of color to show up to like, fully function as an institution and like get them coins, well, you need to create an environment for which they actually want to come to your institution, and they don't want to come to your institution right now because y'all are trash. So how do we become not trash? Well, we got to do these, 14 steps to do that. And now look at you and all the wonderful people who now want to come to your institution instead of going somewhere else because you're doing the work. There you go. So.
Yeah. And, right, like, there is no one answer to all of this, right?
Right.
It is largely dependent on the relationships you have with people. Because, like, even when, like, people don't listen to outsiders.
Yeah.
People, right? You have to have the relationships. And I think, like, there are ways that, like, expert culture is problematic. Where people will say, like, oh, like, well, this person from this place did it in this way. Like, let's just do that. Like, that's not... Like there can be pros and cons to that, right? Like, oh, great, you had this idea about like we want to be like a more inclusive place, but the way that they did it there is not necessarily the thing that is going to bring equity to the space that you're in. I'm really curious then what I asked you at the beginning, like what gives you hope, but I guess for me, like what do you hope for your institution, maybe like in the next 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think for me that my ultimate goal really is that like circling is happening, that we are very intentional about creating space for people to unlearn. And so like one of the things I'm doing this spring is I'm doing like a little Multicultural Leadership Institute where we're definitely going to be engaging in like circle practices and stuff like that. But that at every level of the institution, we know what restorative justice is, or transformative justice, or like all of these different thought processes are, and not the expectation that like we're gonna be implementing them so much, but that we are at least starting to think about what small shifts that we could do. So again, like what are the net positives that we could do and that we can create at the institution? Would I love to throw away our whole conduct system? Yes. Do I think that's going to happen in a 5-year time? Well, it depends. No, like depends on how much control they give me. No. But that we are, thinking about we're starting to see. And I'm like, I just wrote a chapter on restorative justice and sexual assault, and I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, yes, let's do this, and on the other hand, I'm like, you know what? No, let's not do this. Let's not. We're not prepared for that. But again, just how do we as institutions start thinking broadly, more deeply about harm and not just policy, not just what's a violation. And so part of that is through my work around, bias incident protocol stuff. So like it's not a policy violation, but it still has an impact. And how do I get the rest of the campus community to understand that impact and that harm and see this work as valuable? So I think that my ultimate goal is, one, we're really focusing on the community piece, and that two, we're thinking more broadly about the concept of impact and harm beyond policy violation. And then in my ideal world, we would just throw the whole conduct system away.
And replace it with
a restorative process.
Yeah. What does it take to, like, what is it going to take to do that?
I think one is the people of the institution would have to completely understand what this type of accountability looks like and how it is, it's returning to a degree a lot of our cultural roots, and that what we have seen as justice hasn't really done what we thought it was doing or could do for us. So we got to spend some time realigning our ideals of justice, to start. Then we've got to spend some time within that, really, again, thinking about who's worthy of this justice, of this form of justice or thinking. Because people will be like, yeah, I'm down, like, we don't need to be punished because I'm thinking about me and my friends. But when I start thinking about people who are not in my community, well, I don't want this for them. I want them to get this harsh stuff because they're bad people. So you've got to spend some time, again, really thinking about the humanity of everybody in your community, and that everybody in your community, regardless of their background or their different lived experiences, is worthy of the same kind of accountability and redemption that you hope for yourself. And then again, I think it's also then getting people in the practice or the habit of using or being engaged in this way of being as a part of, like, their ongoing processes. So as much as they possibly can, doing, like, check-in questions, or, like, being a circle, using the restorative language, and, like, and then throwing in some transformative justice in there too. Like, throwing in these kind of things that they're just kind of always practicing. So I still always think back to my experience with that non-traditional high school. There was 2 girls who were literally about to get into a physical fight. Like, you could see the girl, like, raise her arm, and then she took a breath, and then she was like, we need a circle. And I was just like, what just happened? And the other girl was like, yeah, I'm gonna go get Mr. Evans. And then she went and got Mr. Evans, and, he grabbed the floating teacher to take over his class, and they went and did their, like, whole process. But part of it is, again, they knew about it, and they were engaged in it. They did circles every single morning. They did circle processes and check-ins in their advisory courses. They did it at the close of every day. They were using it for their conduct process. So they were deeply embedded in this way of kind of thinking and processing their emotions. And so, there was, like, that original habit of, like, well, I'm about to fight you. And then it was like, wait, why am I going to fight you when we have this whole process that we've been engaged in? And, like, to see that for me was, like, that was the moment for me where I was like, I am sold on this work. But again, it was a small enough community that they could do that. They could really be deeply embedded into this work. Do I think they were doing it perfectly? Probably not. But they were doing it enough that there was this type of impact that happened in that community and in that space. And so that's what I would love to see happening, in institutions of higher education, especially at my own institution. But we're much larger, and so that takes a lot of work. So right now it's, like, focusing in on the small pocket of communities that I can work with to get them to start thinking that same way of, like, why do I need to fight you when we have a process to really unpack our emotional things that we're experiencing with each other right now to address our needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, the question that's present for me after all that is, like, so what, at the beginning, we're talking about liberation. So what does this have to say to, like, what we're dealing with in the United States on a larger scale?
That we're trash humans now. I think it is that because we have been I was going to say we're socially isolated, but I'm not talking about in terms of COVID. I mean, we are literally actually socially isolated from different pockets of communities, and we have seen, and we have been told repeatedly that this is how we serve justice in our communities. And when we see things like responses to police brutality of, like, well, if you had just complied, like, that type of stuff tells me that we have a lot of work to do, again, around thinking about and unlearning this idea of, like, what someone deserves and doesn't deserve because they complied or didn't comply. So, like, even if you didn't comply, does that
mean that person is that complied or not, right?
Exactly, right? And so we have to, as a collective country, again, start to think about, like, the whole, like, I mean, if we're not a Christian nation, but let's just say for the sake of argument, we are a Christian nation, right? This idea of, like, love thy neighbor, well, where is that at? Like, we're not doing that. We're not practicing that love thy neighbor aspect of this thing that we keep saying that we are. And if I'm loving my neighbor, then I would want what's best for my neighbor, and I would see them as I see myself. Love thy neighbor as I love thyself. But perhaps we don't love ourselves, and that's part of where, again, that work has to, I think, to be done, is to starting with our own individual selves of, like, how do we understand ourselves and our worldviews and our ideas and our values, and how do we see that as in relationship to then the people around us. You were going to say something.
I was going to say a couple of things. I think, like, because we're not a Christian nation, I do have, like, a background in Christianity, right? And, like, that parable about, like, you know, the Good Samaritan, like, that's where, like, the love my neighbor, who is my neighbor, right?
Right.
People won't agree on, like, who your neighbor is, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so like, for me, it, like, comes back to this idea of, you know, like, Ubuntu, right? Like, I am because you
because
are.
We
like,
are. Right.
In Lakesh, like, I am another you, you are another me. Like, metakuya us, and, like, we are all relatives. Like, I don't think the thing to say is, like, no, we're all Americans, right? Like,
right.
I don't care about, like, the borders of, like, the United States and, like, the construction of the Constitution. It's just, like, you know, we're humans and let's take care of each other. But if we can't get to, like, you know, that convergence of interest, like, I'm at a loss for a lot of this, right? I mean, to the point about, like, us being, like, in our, like, you know, political bubbles, right?
Mm-hmm.
The things that, like, we put out through, like, Amplify RJ channels, right? Like, they go to, like, tens of thousands of people, right? And we get almost zero hate on it, right? Because those are people who are, like, actively searching to, like, learn about this stuff, right? Like, the internet can be, like, a wild and crazy place, but, like, for us so far, it hasn't been, because, like, there are people who are, like, actively going after this, and, like, that's great, and, like, I can be really hopeful about that, but, like, I know there is a vast majority.
Right.
There's a vast majority of the country who can't give a definition of the word restorative justice, right?
Right.
And if they did have, like, a definition of restorative justice being, you know, a philosophy, set of practices, way of being, right, rooted in our indigenous roots of the value of interconnection, both proactively building and maintaining relationships and repairing relationships when harm occurs, right? People can get on board with that, right? Maybe. And then, like, what does that mean in practice?
Practice, right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. That's always the hard part, is, like, I think there's a lot of people who theoretically will always say, you know, yes, you know, the good for the people around me and da-da-da-da-da, but when it comes to actually the doing part of it, and I think it's also, it's the feeling of, we have been so conditioned around, like, the idea of, like, market value and capitalism and these types of things, that, like, this idea of I have to give up something for someone else to get something, and not thinking about the way in which that then becomes cyclical. Like, well, yes, if you're giving up something for this person to give something, then they're also giving up something, perhaps then that you can get something. But we often only see it as a, like, well, but I gave up something. Like, yeah, but you're, like, getting something in return. Mm-hmm. But, like, we just can't, you can't get to that second part of, like, it's just like, but I gave up something. Like, yes, and there's an and there. You got something. No? Yeah. Okay. And they're just, like, stuck on, like, I have to give up something.
Right. Like, I don't want to be, like, super reductive, but, like, oh, like, I'm giving up my homogenous community, but I got Mexican food. Oh my gosh. Right. Like I don't know. I'm just being silly. That's just the first thing that came to my brain.
I mean, yeah, yes, like, right, like, you get this other thing, like, you get things that you didn't experience before, and you didn't have before, and that, now you have access to, and that, you're now privileged to, that perhaps you weren't privileged to before. And again, if we're all contributing, then we're all benefiting, but...
Right. And, like, again, it wasn't to, like, reduce, like,
right.
people to the food they offer, right? But, like, the experiences and the exposure to, like, things different perspectives, like, help us create solutions and build in ways that, like, we couldn't have without others. I gave my definition of restorative justice. How do you define restorative justice?
I see restorative justice as a way of thinking about how we are in relation with one another and what we can do for one another in terms of accountability and support. I see it as a means by which we are engaging in both harm reduction and harm prevention, and as a way of, and I don't really like saying rehumanizing people but that's the only word I can think of right now, but I don't like it, but it's all I have in my head, so we're going to use that. It's a way of rehumanizing people. Yeah.
We talked about higher education, and maybe that's the answer, but what's one place or situation where you wish people really knew this work?
Kindergarten. Start early. I think I often show in some of my work and around other stuff the Jane Elliott experiment, the brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment. Mm-hmm. And I show that because, those were third graders, right? They understood very quickly how to create systems of discrimination and prejudice and how to internalize that in all of 15 minutes. It didn't take very long. And so we do our deepest learning and development that early, right? So, if we start as early as kindergarten 1 of, again, being in this practice of checking in, and not necessarily even being in a circle, but, like, the concept of, like, learning and caring for people and connecting and finding ways in which we are similar, but also acknowledging the ways that we're different, but that difference is not a way in which we should treat each other. We shouldn't treat each other differently because of those differences, and we start that early, and we are creating those intentional spaces. Then I think this and it continues beyond that point. Obviously, we can't just start at kindergarten because I don't remember much around kindergarten other than flipping over a bar and biting my tongue because I got apple juice that day. This is why I remember. Because otherwise I had to have milk, and I don't like milk. But, like...
That's a whole nother thing. Why is milk served in schools when so many students are lactose intolerant? Anyway.
Right, exactly. So this is why I remember that day wholeheartedly, because I was like, oh, I got apple juice today. But, but then continuing that stuff. And again, like, I think about the fact that I was thinking about these ideas in the 6th grade, but I didn't really have the lens for which to talk about. So obviously they were probably embedded in my head long before that, but as you grow, you start to conceptualize it. So again, if we start thinking about this interconnectedness and we're intentional about that from a very early age, then I think it continues into us as adults and as people who then have influence to shift and change what it is that we do and how we engage with one another.
Yeah. How has knowing this work impacted your life outside of work?
I do everything in circles. I kind of do. Like, even, like, I met my biological father for the first time 5 years ago. And so engaging with him, it's not obviously like in an actual circle because it's just the two of us, but the way in which I communicate with him is like through like this restorative lens of like for my own like connection and development of a relationship with him. I'm trying to do that. I'm not as successful because again, when it's yourself, it's a lot harder to do that because the pessimist in me is avoiding certain things, but still engaging some of these kind of practices with my biological father. So and then with my friends, check-ins, and with the classes that I teach and doing check-ins and community building processes. And I think again, just I'm more conscious of my language, regardless of the situation and how I'm communicating with people. I think it's just embedded in just like the small things that I do, sometimes that I'm not even aware that I'm doing it, until somebody will point it out, and I'm like, oh, I did do that. Well, it was a good thing, so let's just go with that. It's fine.
Yeah, for sure. You get to sit in circle with 4 people that are alive. Who are they, and what do you talk about?
Oh, gosh. Oh, man. Okay. Michael Jackson. So I've got questions. It's not because of like a restorative thing. I just have a number of questions. Lyndon B. Johnson.
Oh, interesting.
It's like a lot. I would like to, if I could, I would like to know. This sounds so messed up. I want to know the person who was taken from the continent of Africa and brought to the United States of America. That is my ancestor of how my lineage arrived in this country. So I'd like to sit down with that person. And then my mom. And I think all of that really is just, again, is rooted in this, like, this idea of, like, lineage and heritage and package. So, again, I think about, like, again, so my ancestor and, like, Lyndon B. Johnson around, like, Civil Rights Act and all that type of stuff, and, like, the motivation and, like, what was his interest convergence, and, like, unpacking that, and, like, because, he was still racist, but whatever. And then Michael Jackson. So here's why Michael Jackson.
Yeah, I was like, so how does that one fit? But go for it.
So kind of in the same way, right? Like, so like, okay, so theoretically speaking, he has vitiligo. But I don't know about you, but the way that I understand the vitiligo works, it doesn't work the way that it worked on him. But also then looking at the plastic surgery and also, so again, I'm thinking about like this idea of like ancestral history and like the commodification of Black bodies and the cultural influences of like Western culture, into the point of like Michael Jackson being this prominent kind of Black figure in the community who like changed their appearance to fit into this kind of like Western concept or this European concept of like beauty and understanding, even though they were this pillar of like what we would now say is like Black excellence. And like the why of like what was going through your head in this way that's there. And then like again, then thinking, it's just getting, my mom, because my mom, but like again, how does she, because she's always been very like things that were like, always like the natural hair and like cutting off all her hair, and has always been very consistent around like her Blackness is beautiful, and like owning that and loving that in ways that like didn't pass down to me as much, but I'm working on it. And so I just see like this like lineage of like how Black people operate in this country, I think is really what I want to understand from these different perspectives of people. But then I also have questions around like the whole Macaulay Culkin thing, and like I want to know, like, and like, and like what was happening at Neverland. I'm curious because, like, like, are you canceled? Like, I need to know if I can listen to Michael Jackson's music is what I need to know right now, honestly, because I love Michael Jackson's work, but also some questionable things in his history that make me say that I probably shouldn't give his family money still off of his work. But, like, it's good work, but also, you get what I'm saying here.
It's complicated, for sure.
So,
for sure.
I'm like, I need answers.
Definitely. What's one thing you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
To buy the Colorizing Restorative Justice book. There's 18...
At livingjusticepress.org.
There's 18 great chapters of work. I've only read 12 of them, to be honest, but the 12 that I have read have all been great. And I think it's a really good, I think it is particularly for white folks who are doing this work. I think it's an excellent tool to really help challenge how you show up in spaces as facilitators in particular. But I think to everyone too, again, I definitely say, I'm like, weird, start with chapter 18. Maybe not. That might be a bit hard.
No, I mean, I think that's a good place to start.
I'm like, start with chapter 18. Start there. And again, especially for folks who are planning on being facilitators or circle keepers or whatever, to really unpack your life and do some unlearning of yourself and really understanding how you show up as a facilitator or circle keeper or whatever, before you are really engaging in this work. So you have to know what your triggers are, where you're limited in your understanding and scope of particular communities that perhaps you're working with, finding connections to other people who can help you in that growth and development, and then paying people who can help fill in those gaps that perhaps you can't.
Absolutely.
You can't facilitate yourself.
Yeah. So it's on livingjusticepress.org. Right now you can buy it in a bundle with Circle Forward, book from Kay Pranis. We'll have that all linked in the show notes. And in line with that, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast feed because we'll be having conversations with many of the authors as well. Who's one person I should have on the podcast? And you have to help me get them on.
Ooh, that's good. Maybe Barb Sherrard is an author in the book. I don't know if you've already had her on the show.
She is scheduled.
Okay, good.
And so by the time this airs, it will have already happened. So give me another one.
Okay, let me think. Nejma Celestine Donor. And she is doing work out of... Is she at the University of Maryland at Baltimore? And so she does some RJ work, but she is there... Oh gosh, I can't remember the title. It's like Assistant Dean of like Diversity, Equity, Inclusion or something like that. And she's a fantastic human and is doing this work and is really thinking about it from the lens of like racial trauma and RJ. And so Nejma, and I'll email you afterwards too, just make sure you have the name right.
I'm looking forward to that email introduction.
Yeah.
And then finally, how can people support you or get in touch with you in the ways that you want to be supported?
You can reach me via email. Desiree.anderson27@gmail.com. I think to support the work, I mean, one obviously is reaching out and asking for consultation, but more importantly is I think for me that is, as I asked before, is that you are doing your own investment in your unlearning and preparing so that you can show up as the best facilitator, so that as people are engaging with restorative justice and restorative practices, that they're getting the best experiences, so that the name of RJ is not being tainted. That's what I want.
Yeah.
And that's how you can support me.
Because we are all interconnected. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for being here with us. So much wisdom. Everyone else will be back in a week with another conversation. Take care until then.
Elise here. What a fantastic episode. Thank you so much to Desiree for all of your incredible thoughts. So one thing that I took away from this episode was the importance of acknowledging harm beyond policy violations. Having empathy and digging deeper to know the person instead of the violation itself is essential to restorative justice. In what ways do you acknowledge and address emotional harm that extends beyond policy? A quote that really stuck out to me was, "Restorative justice is a way of being. It's not a thing that you do." As we end this podcast, I would like you to think about this. How will you practice restorative justice in your personal life and in all interactions with others? Although this episode has come to a close, there are so many ways to stay involved with Amplify RJ. To learn more, please check out the Black Her Story reading list and our History of Black Abolition Movements workshops. Thank you so much for listening, and back to you, David.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.